Good morning. Welcome to the August 31st edition of the New Britain Forum on the New Britain Progressive website. My name is John McNamara, and we're joined today by first-term Alderman-at-Large Chris Anderson, who was endorsed last week by the Democratic Town Committee for a new term on the Common Council. Chris is majored in anthropology at Colorado State University. He has a master's in accounting at the University of Connecticut. And he moved to Connecticut. His wife, Shelby, is a homeowner 2 times over. And we want to welcome you today, Chris. And I'd like to begin by asking you, you've established yourself as a real fiscal watchdog, which is the primary job of the city council, to adopt a budget every year.
Yep.
And watch over the finance system of the city. So the council adopted a $243 million budget in early June with a 2% tax decrease. I'd like to know what you like about this budget that started July 1 and what budget priorities, in your view, are missing.
Sure, John. And first, I just wanted to thank you for having me here. Thank you to the New Britain Progressive for hosting this. I think it's a great opportunity, to talk to the community a little bit and get some of these, nuts and bolts out in the open. So the council did adopt a $243 million budget. It was a party line vote, though, because we feel that the mayor's proposed budget missed the mark in a lot of important ways. It does do good things, though. There are a lot of services that continue to be funded. Our parks and recreation, fire, those sorts of things are still funded and funded to the levels. Not necessarily that they need to be, because we always need more, but they're doing what they've been doing, which is good. But it didn't address some of the community issues that the community has called in and asked for more than a year, and it didn't address some things like equity. The most important thing, though, is it didn't provide more funding directly to the Board of Education. New Britain remains next to last in education funding per student, and the outcomes reflect that. And although the mayor decided to go to war with the Board of Education this budget season, the numbers and the research just really doesn't support her viewpoint, which is that somehow we have an administrative problem on the Board of Ed side and not a funding problem. But if you look across the state, if you look at county to county, or even by our neighbors, like, everybody tends to have more funding for us, and therefore they have better outcomes. And then the other thing too is that because New Britain has such a high rate of poverty and things like childhood trauma, single family households, all of those things result in needing more funding in the school system to sort of make up for whatever deficiency happens on the other end. And communities like New Britain have high concentrations of those things, whereas where I went to high school was Colchester, Connecticut, doesn't really have a high concentration of single family households. And so the school district doesn't need as much per student to make up for that, and yet they have more funding per student. So the Democrat proposed budget did have more funding for education. It also had more funding for the library and for youth services. These are things that the mayor has flat funded for the last 5 years. And, it really shows the priorities, right? Who uses these services and who needs those services.
Can I ask you, Chris, the administration would claim that they funded education. I think it was $500,000, which doesn't go as far as it used to, but where is that money, and what about the counter to your argument that they are giving more money to education?
So there was $500,000 that Democrats proposed go directly to the Board of Education, that in the mayor's budget goes to a city-side education savings account. And so the Board of Education can access those funds, but they have to request it the city council. And so essentially, the mayor and the Republicans have set up another roadblock for education access. And it also means that those funds are very likely to be used only for sort of capital improvements. There is a pool of money that they set aside previously that is going to be used for handicap accessibility upgrades at the high school. But the process of getting that money out of the council is proving to be a little bit longer than it maybe needed to be. And I think that the better thing to do would be to give the money directly to the people who are going to spend it and allow them to spend that money. It's about trust and partnership, and we don't have that right now.
So I see that. So the Board of Ed would have to request the money of the city. So it's really not an appropriation to the schools at this point.
No, not unless the council approves of whatever request the Board of Education comes up with. The budget also doesn't fully fund contractual obligations, and what I mean by that is pensions for our public safety professionals, our police and fire, as well as employee health care. This is something that Mayor Stewart has done over and over again, where she's underfunded either pensions or our self-insurance fund or both, as a way of sort of evening out the budget. And it's something that you can get away with in the very short term, but the more you do it, the bigger the bill comes due in the end. And this is something that New Britain, we've been down this path before. Decades ago, we had to borrow about $40 million for pensions, because previous administrations, way back, well before my time, of course, didn't pay those bills. And that original bonding of $40 million has now been refinanced twice, because we just keep not coming up with the money to pay for the thing. So this is a very dangerous road to go down.
So you're asserting that we're underfunding pension obligations on a year-to-year basis, or just because this is an election year?
Should we every year, every single year, every budget that I've had a look at, pensions have been underfunded. Last year actually was the worst, because there was a $15 million deficit built into that budget, by not paying pretty much anything towards healthcare and pensions. This year was a little bit better. More money did go to pensions, thanks mostly to state aid, honestly, that allowed for more revenue. But it still didn't fully fund it based on the formulas that the actuaries give us, and the city finance department gives us for making sure those things are topped off.
Well, this sort of you're jumping into my next question, which is without the I guess 100 million or so in state aid, the mill rate would be 90 mills or more, instead of the 49.5 we have on paper now. To what extent is the administration borrowing, incurring debt, particularly incurring debt to pay for operating expenses?
Well, anytime that you borrow money through bonding is typically the way that it happens. You're pushing out a current year payment to a future year. Sometimes it's way far in the future, 20 or 30 years in the future. The most recent refinance that was done is only like 4 or 5 years in the future. So you're really not buying yourself a lot of time when you do it that way, to sort of figure out spending cuts or revenue increases otherwise, not through taxes that you can pay for those bills that are coming due. So this administration has refinanced, I think 5 times now, pretty much almost every year that she's been in office. It has been a key strategy for reducing costs, but it comes at a very significant future cost to taxpayers. And by not paying, by refinancing and not having to pay for debt service, not making your car payment essentially, she's made room for other things, other beautification projects and things like that. But it's not just borrowing. This year, honestly, the tax break would not have been possible if it was not for millions and millions of dollars and more in state aid. Some of that is hopefully permanent state aid, like the increase in pilot money, which is payment in lieu of taxes from the university and from the hospital. But some of it was sort of just like a one-time borrowing, about $3 million because of the pandemic, right? And so there, as far as I've seen, there's no plan on how we're going to make up for that loss of $3 million in the next budget, nor is there any plan on how we're going to figure out that $15 million hole that we refinanced out of in the pandemic as a way of not increasing taxes when we just weren't sure of the impacts of the pandemic at that time.
So it's in my youth overusing the credit card. It's using a credit card to operate the city to a greater extent than paying as you go.
Right. And, and I want to be clear, too, that debt is not necessarily bad. Every municipality does use debt. There is, sometimes it makes sense. But in New Britain, we have this weird sort of dual track where we're refinancing on one hand in off election years because everything is terrible. And then now in an election year, we have a tax decrease and, oh my gosh, everything's fine. Ignoring that, in this same budget, we've underfunded things. In the same budget, we're relying on state aid and refinancing that we can't rely on again. And so this is really, in my view, this 2% tax break, it's really a one-time thing. It can't be sustained indefinitely because we're not paying for things that we're legally obligated to pay for. So it's really just a tax break gimmick in my mind. But if we're going to give one, to be clear, we could have given one that was, if we're going to give a tax break, we could have given one that was more equitable. This was a $1 million decrease for real estate, business property, and for motor vehicles. But that's really going to result in businesses and landlords and single family homeowners getting the bulk of the increase, because a $1 million decrease on, a $5,000 car is $5. Like, that's not really enough to really make a difference. And in this city, you have 60% of our households are renters, and the tax break on the landlord side is not big enough that you're going to pass through a rent decrease or not raise rents. So it's really a tax break that benefited single family homeowners and landlords. And the Democrats had proposed reducing the car tax mill rate by 5 instead, to have a more significant impact on working people and all people, not just homeowners. But of course, Republicans said no to that too.
Okay. Yeah, that's the percentage of in 2019, the percentage of the debt service was a little over 9% of expenditures. I'd imagine that may have gone up slightly in the new budget, but 9 or 10%. As you say, debt is and bonding is a good way for a city to use it judiciously to meet its deliver services, but to pay for operating expenses from year to year, it pushes the can down the road.
Right. Bonding is really intended for, if used well, for big capital projects that will last 20 or 30 years or more, and there's just really no way to come up with that money in the short term. But refinancing is not that, right? Refinancing is pushing debt down the road to pay for current expenses, without getting anything. When we refinance, we don't buy a new park or a new school. We just buy space in this year's budget. And so it's a really dangerous strategy, but it's politically amenable because you don't have to deal with the hard questions of, do we need to raise taxes? Do we need to cut expenses? If so, how much and where? So it's a way to sort of like make it look like things are good and that we've covered everything that we need to cover, when in reality, we're just sort of pushing off that really hard conversation for later.
Sounds like a campaign strategy. Okay. So no matter who's mayor or who's on the council, yourself included, city finances relies largely on the regressive property tax. We see there's a new study that the legislature is going to undertake to analyze once again the tax burden, which will answer the same questions again in terms of the burden falls most heavily on low and middle income homeowners and property taxpayers and working people.
Yeah.
What steps or policies do you think can be adopted to reduce that burden on modest level homeowners, renters, people on fixed incomes within the current system, knowing the constraints?
Yeah, well, so I think it's important to note first that like the system has to change before we're really going to have equity. If you plot out every municipality in the state and you look at their grand list value per person, so how much our property is worth essentially, and you look at the tax rate, like it's almost a straight line that when the property value goes up, the tax rate goes down. It's really not about fiscal management. It's about how much wealth you have in a community. But so that really has to change at the state level with the car tax and the property tax before we can really sort of solve that big structural problem. But within the system that we have now, I think New Britain can do better than we're doing. And one of the things that we can do is to stop giving gigantic tax breaks to out-of-state wealthy developers when they come and they want to build luxury condos or something else here. New Britain residents got a 2% tax break in this current budget, but there is a downtown developer who got essentially an 85% tax break as a way to bring luxury condos to downtown. And the argument is always, we need these people to come downtown. They'll spend money and it'll it'll generate revenue for everybody. But I think studies across the nation have shown that like these gigantic tax breaks tend to not pan out for the city coffers. And so what we've essentially done is subsidized the profit of a developer and incurred more costs because more people are going to move to downtown, and the city is then going to have to provide service to those people in terms of public safety, street cleaning. God forbid any of them have kids. Now we have more kids in our school system that we now have to figure out how to fund, even though we don't have enough funding already. The other thing is that we really have to think about partnerships. So, for example, partnerships with the Board of Education to reduce costs and share services, partnerships with our neighboring towns to do the same, partnerships with the state to do the same. What we have right now is like this system where we're tough, right? We're going to bootstrap our way out of it. We're going to do it all by ourselves. We don't need anybody's help. And at the same time, pointing fingers when things don't go our way. And that's just, our problems are too big and too complex to take that strategy. Like we really have to be able to sit down with a diverse group of stakeholders and say, look, these are the problems we want to solve. How do we keep elderly folks in their homes? They've lived here in New Britain and paid taxes all their lives, and they really would like to stay here. How do we make that happen? And so, but you need, when you give a tax break to anybody, you have to make up the revenue somewhere else. And so those are the sort of the strategies that we have to think about.
Yeah, the tax abatement situation needs to be a case-by-case thing as well, in terms of giving a break to those who may need it least, I think you're pointing.
Well, right. And when we do these breaks, do we do it for short term, five years, maybe 10 years as a way to spur development? But what the Republicans on the council have passed once, and we're going to see this again, are 30-year fixed tax rates that are way lower than anybody else pays. And so as residents of New Britain have to sort of grapple with our changing finances and the changing economic climate over time, these developers have, like, they know what they're going to pay for 30 years. And it's just not justified. It's not equitable.
Yeah, well, that's very insightful about a 30-year. I wasn't aware of a 30-year tax abatement, but I'll keep that in mind if I ever become a big-time developer.
Yep.
A final area I'd like to raise with you, Chris, is the city is getting upwards of $60 million in federal funds that are largely unrestricted. They're not earmarked particularly for a specific set of needs to respond to the current needs and recover from the pandemic, which unfortunately may be hanging on for a while longer.
Yeah.
what do you know about the plan to use it? And do you have ideas about your own ideas about using it for short-term and long-term needs?
So I wish I had any idea what the plan was, but the mayor has kept that information completely secret. At the last council meeting, we did unanimously approve funding for Osgood Park renovation because public access to green space in a neighborhood that really needs it, is something that I do think matters in terms of improving public services and public health. And we also did approve some funding for new ambulances for our EMS service because, again, public health and public safety are important services that we offer. And as part of that, I did ask for, what's the plan with the rest of the money? I'd really like to not vote on this on an a la carte basis because, before we know it, the $60 million is going to be gone. And I'm still waiting to hear back. The mayor claims that she has plans and plans and plans, but then will not make them available or has not made them available. And I think that's a mistake because, this is a rare opportunity to address some long-term structural problems that we have in the city. We have a lot of infrastructure needs that this money could be used for in terms of water and sewer upgrades that'll make sure that we have affordable and clean water for years and years to come. That's an important asset of the city. It can be used on, road and sidewalk improvement, sidewalk widening, because mobility and access are, incredibly important. We have a huge portion of our population that doesn't have access to a car, and so we need to make sure that we have ways for them to get around. The pandemic also revealed the importance of the internet. Many of us knew this before, but the pandemic really, really made it clear that New Britain schools, for the first time, got one-to-one devices, but a lot of students didn't have internet at home, and so they had a computer that they couldn't log into to do their schoolwork. And a task force was set up between the city and the Board of Ed to try and address this problem. But when you're dealing with things reactively like that, it's just that the devices weren't available. We were trying to hang Wi-Fi devices up in neighborhoods, and we couldn't get them. And so we really have to take some time to think about the long-term sustainable infrastructure, not these really short-term fixes. But also some of this funding should probably be used to provide direct relief to homeowners and businesses that felt the impacts of the pandemic. It's a rare opportunity and pool of money for these really big projects. But it's also a rare opportunity to provide some direct relief to help people get through next year or the next year after.
One-time funds that make the government feel like it's flush with money, as somebody called it, a sugar high, but it's going to be utilized quickly, and it needs to be used for immediate and maybe address some long-term issues.
Right.
Well, this has been a good dose of municipal finance.
I'm sorry for everybody listening. I know this is the most riveting of everything we do here in New Britain.
It's probably all I can take this morning. So, but it is an important thing, and it reflects really the role of the Common Council and the mayor to address these issues with equity and fairness. At least that should be the goal. So, Chris, thanks for being our second guest on the New Britain Forum.
Thank you for having me.
I want to thank everybody who's going to listen to this, who's listening now. Look forward to seeing you next time. If you have ideas on topics or guests, you can email thebritainprogressive@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.